Hello, and welcome to the Cook Memorial Public Library podcast, where we invite you to spend just a few minutes with the staff at Cook Library. I'm Nate Goss, and welcome to another edition of The Past is Present, our Libertyville local history podcast series. Today, we've asked Jenny Berry, our local history librarian, to come back onto the podcast to talk about Frederick Grabbe. Back in episode 27 of this podcast, Jenny touched on the little-known fact that at one time, Libertyville's claim to fame was its water, spring water to be exact. This piece of Libertyville trivia was just odd enough that we needed to dig a little deeper, and we really can't talk about Libertyville's water history without talking about Frederick Grabbe. So, Jenny, let's start with the basics. Who was Frederick Grabbe?
All right. Well, thanks for having me again.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Frederick Grabbe came to this country at the age of 3 with his family from Hanover, Germany. He was born in 1842 and came over in 1845. We think they settled in Fremont Township at the beginning. There's a mention in Frederick's obituary that his father, Ludwig, died while the family lived in Chicago. But I can't find any information about their time in Chicago. We do know that his mother, Dorothea, Frederick's mother, Dorothea, had remarried and had another child by 1855, and they were living in Fremont Township with August Fisher, who was the new husband. So Frederick most likely grew up in Fremont Township on the farm of August Fisher.
Now, were there a lot of immigrants coming to this area at that time, German immigrants, or does that just sort of, would he have been sort of an outsider?
I don't think so. I don't know specifically. I haven't done a lot of research on German immigration trends or specific times. It would not be unusual for there to be Germans in the area. There are other German names throughout Libertyville's early history.
Sure.
So that would not have been so unusual.
But we still know who this guy is, as opposed to a lot of people who lived during that time. So what really is the reason that Frederick Grabbe made a name for himself in this area?
Sure. Well, what he's really known for, I think, for those who read history in Libertyville, is for Abana Spring Water Company. It actually started out under another name. It was called Hygienic or Hygiene Water in the early 1890s. Basically, Libertyville had these springs that we kind of talked about before that ran down what is today Lake Street and then took a little jog and then went over on Newberry Avenue. And the Libertyville Illustrated that we mentioned in our last podcast talks about the earliest well being drilled in 1878 or dug. We know for certain that the water had started to be bottled by the 1890s, and Frederick Grabbe was really the first person to take that water, bottle it, and sell it.
Was there any type of like a filtration system, or they're just taking this stuff out of the springs,
No, this
putting
is
in the
like
bottle?
crystal spring water. Yeah. And actually, I don't have the breakdown of the analysis with me at the moment, but in 1897, there is an article in the newspaper which shows that it had been sent for analysis and what was in it and how clear it was, completely free of organic matter. So this was some super good water.
It really was. It really was. And so what happened, I mean, we'll get into Frederick Grabbe, I think, a little bit more in a bit, but you're talking about these springs that existed that really were really good water in Libertyville. What happened to all of them? Do you know?
I don't know for certain. We know that with Frederick Grabbe, he died in 1915. His grandson, in a letter to the Libertyville Mundelein Historical Society, said that the Abana Spring Water sort of ceased with him. His son, Charles, in 1920 census, says that he is part of a retail spring water business. So the business may have continued somewhat, but Charles also passed in 1920. So there's no evidence that Abana Spring Water went past at that time at least. There was another company that was set up in the early 1900s called Libertyville Crystal Spring, which was located at what is today Church and 4th Avenue. Sometimes in the histories it's confused, Abana Water and Libertyville Crystal Springs, but they really were two separate companies.
Sure.
Frederick Grabbe was not involved in Libertyville Crystal Springs.
Competitors, maybe.
They may have been competitors for some time. We do know that Frederick Grabbe started his water bottling over on Newberry, but by 1908, he had purchased a lot over on Park Place, so behind St. Joseph's School. The article in the paper said that his demand had expanded so much that he needed to supplement his Abana Spring Water, and so opened up a second location, basically. What we don't know is whether that was hiding that his other spring was drying up. There's some talk in some of the sources that when the train came that way, so Newberry Avenue backs up right to where the train track goes through across Milwaukee Avenue today. The train didn't originally come through that way, but that spur was put over in about 1900. So I've seen some speculation that when the train track came through and the grading happened, that somehow affected the springs that was along Newberry Avenue. I don't know that there's any proof of that, if that's just conjecture.
Okay. So, I think a lot of us have this idea that bottled water is kind of a newer thing. We think of plastic, and it wasn't that long ago that I think we would even hear still comedians joke about the idea that people pay to drink, bottled water when you can get it for free from the tap. So here we're talking about someone who made Libertyville famous by bottling water, essentially. So were people using this to just drink the water? Were there other uses for the water? Why were people, even back in the 19th century, buying water from Libertyville?
Well, there really was at one time a big deal about the health benefits of water. If you think about the fact that there really wasn't, it was all well water. Things were pumped. We didn't have water coming in from the lake. There weren't, as you mentioned, filtration systems. So if you had a source of actually fairly pure water, that is a big thing.
Yeah, a luxury item almost.
Exactly, really. And so you mentioned in the last episode that people drank the water for a lot of times for the health benefits. They saw that it cleared up skin, especially there's also sulfur water that was bottled in town, and that is very good for digestion and kidneys and all sorts of skin ailments. So to buy bottled water might have been somewhat of a luxury, but it was seen oftentimes as good for the health.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Fred. Let's go back to Frederick.
Sure.
Aside from the fact that he started this company, what do we know about this guy?
So most of what we know starts when he joined the Civil War. So he served in the Civil War. He was about 18 at the time when he joined up in October of 1861, so just months after the outbreak of the war. He served in the 51st Infantry, Illinois Infantry. He actually served for 4 years in the war and survived, according to his obituary, 31 battles.
31.
31. Yeah, and I have not tracked that down to see if his company actually fought in 31 battles, but that was reported in his obituary. He actually did suffer a musket ball wound to his left shoulder at the Battle of Chickamauga, which was in September of 1863. He was very lucky just to get away with that because...
No amputations necessary?
No, he didn't, yeah. But the other soldiers in his the 51st Infantry, they lost about half of their soldiers in that battle. So he was admitted to the hospital. Unfortunately, he was in the hospital for about 3 months because while in the hospital recuperating from his gun wound, he contracted smallpox.
Oh, geez. This is pre-vaccine and...
Yeah, and not completely hygienic situation in the field hospitals or even the other hospitals. But, after that, he went back. He had started out as a private. By the time he was discharged in 1865, he was a lieutenant, although friends called him Captain Grabbe for his life.
And so he comes back and he starts this spring water company.
He actually didn't come right back to Libertyville.
No, okay.
Yeah. We don't know. Actually, there's about 4 years or so that are hard to account for between the end of the war and 1870. I'm not sure where he was exactly. By 1870, he's actually living out in Kansas with a man named Captain Kilmer, whose wife turns out in the future to be the sister of Frederick Grabbe's wife-to-be. Now, there may have been some relationship between the families back here in Fremont Township. We're not quite sure of that. But in 1872, Frederick married Libby Gray. And while in Kansas, he was not involved in water whatsoever. He was actually involved in what I think of him as. He's a beekeeper.
Oh, okay.
That's really, to me, after studying him, his passion. And it was a passion for his entire life.
Yeah. So the water paid the bills.
Yeah, exactly. But even throughout his life, he continued to sell bees, to raise bees, to judge honey at fairs. He is oftentimes in the American Bee Journal, in Gleanings in Bee Culture. You'll see him writing in. And he owns a patent, or holds a patent on the Kansas beehive from 1873. One of the most interesting things he did as an apiarist is something called the floating apiary. We'll have a blog post coming out shortly, or it has come out by the time this podcast is published. And there's a picture of this floating apiary. So in about 1876, he and a man named C.O. Perrine went down to New Orleans, set up a sawmill, and started cutting out hives for about 100 hives. And they bought 2 barges, enough to hold 1,000 hives, and put the hives on these barges. And the idea was they were going to travel up the Mississippi River from New Orleans up to St. Paul, Minnesota, and follow the blooms. So, blooming in the south furthest, and then as you move up, the blooms will continue to come. And that way you would be able to gather more honey as you did this migratory beekeeping. It didn't really work out out for them. They were late in getting started due to one of the barges was late in being constructed. So they were about a month and a half late, and so they really couldn't keep up with the blooms. They also experienced engine trouble and had to have repairs. So really just put the whole thing behind schedule. What I find interesting is their plan was they would actually go up the river during the night and then dock during the day and kind of let the bees out. Okay. And then let them come back. Now, as one might expect, they did lose some bees. But the literature also said that sometimes they got some new what they called vagrant bees. So bees who lived in the area would hitch a ride. Okay. So this always makes me think of bees with their little hobo sacks. Yeah. I'm out of here catching a ride, up the river.
Yeah, just a boat full of bees.
Yeah. So eventually, they had to stop, and they took the hives off north of St. Louis, Missouri, and gave up on the adventure. Frederick was back in Libertyville in 1880, continued beekeeping, and then got involved with some other things, obviously the water and things like that. Yeah.
How long did Frederick, what year did he live until?
He died in October of 1915.
Okay.
Just short of his birthday.
Yeah.
He had been down at the state fair in Springfield and was judging honey. Wasn't feeling very well when he got back and was admitted to the hospital and died not too long after that.
Does he still have family in the area, or how are these stories collected? How have they sort of lasted the test of time, and how are we still here talking about Frederick Grabbe?
Sure. Well, how I kind of got introduced to Frederick Grabbe was there's a gentleman named C.E. Carroll who was an early founder of the Historical Society here in town, and he wrote a lot of essays, and one of the essays he wrote was on Frederick Grabbe. And I've since found things that I think might not be quite right in his essay, and things that you are able to support with the additional research. When I was doing the research, one of the great-granddaughters of Frederick Grabbe had donated some things to the Historical Society. So in the Ansleby Cookhouse, we have an Abana Spring Water crate. We also have a duffel bag that Frederick Grabbe carried with him in the Civil War, has his name and infantry number
Very
on
cool.
it.
Yeah.
So I reached out to her. Her name is Libby Grabbe Iverson. And said, hey, can I use some pictures? Can I use these? And so I ended up interviewing her. And then I met her sister, Kathy Grabbe Lukemeyer. And it was just neat to do that. And about 2 years ago, I had finished doing the first round of research on it and happened to be having a vacation with my family to very close to where Kathy lives. So we were able to meet, and I was able to go over the research that I had found on her great-grandfather and share that with her and her sister Libby also. So now, we're all Grabbe descendants. So.
All one big happy Libertyville.
So we're still in contact. So.
It kind of makes you think about just the lives we live and how long they're going to last, or what kind of lasting impression we'll make on the towns that we live in. So
I'm sure Frederick would never have imagined that we'd still be talking on a podcast.
Yeah. What's a podcast?
What is that? Yeah.
Well, I just want to thank you, Jenny, for coming back on the podcast and sharing these stories. I wanted to ask you, though, what are some ways that folks in Libertyville can get more involved in general with their town's history?
If you're just interested in reading about it, just pop in the library. We have several books. We also have clippings files, and you could just randomly pick out a file one day and read through it. We also have several online exhibits through our local history page that give some brief information. Over 1,000 photos and postcards that have been scanned from the Libertyville Mundelein Historical Society collection. If you want to get more involved with it, get involved in the Historical Society. Become a docent, help out in the archives, or just support financially by becoming a member. Is
there a website they can visit?
There is a website. Yeah. The Historical Society has a website, www.lmhistory.org. We also have a Facebook page, so you can look us up that way as well and find out what the Historical Society is up to.
Well, that just about wraps it up here for the episode. I just want to mention to our listeners, you can also check out the local history page on our research section of our website. That's on our website is www.cooklib.org. We always want to mention the library's blog, Shelf Life. Jenny actually, along with a few other librarians, regularly post their fascinatingly quirky Libertyville stories and research. That blog post address is shelflife.cooklib.org, and it's in the Past is Present section of the blog. If you ever want to leave some feedback, maybe even suggest some ideas for some future episodes, you can always talk to us on Twitter with the library's Twitter handle @CookLibrary, or send us an email, webmaster@cooklib.org. If you like what you're hearing, make sure you let everyone know about the podcast. Let them know that they can subscribe in iTunes or really wherever they like to get their podcasts. We will be back soon, but until then, keep reading, keep watching, and keep listening.